I never thought the smell of lemon cleaner would follow me through my entire life, but it did. That sharp, artificial citrus scent became the ghost I couldn't escape, the phantom that haunted every achievement, every victory, every moment when I thought I'd finally moved past where I came from. It's strange how a smell can become so much more than itself, how it can carry entire worlds of meaning compressed into a single sensory experience. When I catch that scent now, even accidentally in an office building or hotel lobby, I'm instantly transported back to being 15 years old, holding a mop in someone else's garage, wearing a gray uniform that was 2 sizes too big, watching my future collapse in real time as Brandon Prescott pointed his phone at me and smiled. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I went from being the maid's son to the man who destroyed Brandon Prescott's entire future in one calculated move, you need to know who I was before everything fell apart, before that video, before the humiliation became the defining event of my adolescence. I was 14 when my father left. Not died, not got sick, not transferred to another city for work, just left. Walked out on a Tuesday morning in March with his work bag slung over his shoulder like he was going to his shift at the electronics repair shop where he'd worked for 11 years, and never came back. It wasn't even dramatic, wasn't preceded by a fight or an ultimatum or any of the warning signs you see in movies. He just woke up, got dressed in his usual work clothes, poured himself coffee in the travel mug I'd given him for Christmas 2 years before, kissed my mother on the cheek like he did every morning, and walked out the door. We didn't know anything was wrong until Thursday when his paycheck didn't arrive in the mail. My mother, Valerie, called the shop first, thinking maybe there'd been some administrative error, maybe the check had been sent to the wrong address or processed late. That's when Frank, the shop owner, told her that my father had quit 2 weeks before. Not given notice, not mentioned it to us, just quit. Told Frank he'd found something better, that he'd be in touch about collecting his last paycheck. Frank had been confused when my father never came back for the money, had even tried calling our house a few times, but my father had apparently intercepted those calls somehow, told Frank he'd pick up the check later, kept the whole thing hidden. It turned out my father had been pretending to go to work for 2 full weeks, leaving every morning at 7:30 with his work bag, coming home every evening at 6:15, covered in the kind of grime that suggested he'd spent the day handling circuit boards and broken electronics. My mother and I never suspected anything. Why would we? People don't usually fake work for 2 weeks before abandoning their families. But apparently that's what he'd been doing, sitting in parking lots, or libraries or coffee shops, or wherever men go when they're building up the courage to abandon their families, working through whatever internal process he needed to work through before he could commit to leaving completely. He left a note. We found it Thursday evening when my mother was looking for the insurance paperwork, thinking we'd need it to figure out what happened to the coverage my father's job provided. The note was in his drawer, tucked under some old tax documents like he'd known we'd eventually end up looking there. It was 3 paragraphs long, written in his careful, precise handwriting on a page torn from a legal pad. I never read it. My mother did once, sitting at the kitchen table with tears running down her face, not making any sound, just reading and crying silently. Then she took the note to the kitchen sink, turned on the gas stove, held the paper to the flame, and watched it burn. I watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash, watched it crumble into nothing, and I saw something in her eyes die that day. Not love for him, she'd stopped loving him years before. I think maybe even before I was born. It was hope. Hope that things might get better, that we might somehow climb out of the hole we'd been living in for as long as I could remember, that there was a future somewhere ahead of us that looked different from the present. I asked her once, a few days later, what the note said. She looked at me for a long time before answering, and I could see her deciding how much truth a 14-year-old could handle. He said he was sorry, she finally told me. He said he tried to be the person we needed, but he wasn't strong enough. He said we'd be better off without him. She paused, then added with a bitterness I'd rarely heard from her, as if leaving us with nothing was somehow a kindness. We lived in Fairfield, a mid-sized town in the Northeast that had once been a manufacturing center, but had slowly transitioned into a service economy after the factories closed. The town had about 40,000 people, a number that had been slowly declining for 2 decades as young people left for cities with better opportunities and older people died without being replaced. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where your reputation was established in elementary school and followed you through your entire life, where the divisions between those who had money and those who didn't wasn't just visible. It was geographic, architectural, fundamental to the entire structure of the community. The West Side, where we rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that had been built in the 1970s and hadn't been updated since, was where the service workers lived. Waitresses and construction workers and retail employees and janitors and home health aides and all the people who kept the town functioning but would never benefit from its prosperity. The apartment buildings were beige or brown or gray, utilitarian structures that prioritized capacity over aesthetics, designed to house as many people as cheaply as possible. The parking lots were cracked and weedy, the playgrounds were made of rusted metal equipment that probably violated current safety codes, and the shared spaces had that worn, defeated quality that comes from decades of minimal maintenance and maximum use. Our apartment was on the 2nd floor of Building C, a corner unit that at least gave us windows on 2 sides, though both views were of other apartment buildings identical to ours. The East Side, where the houses had names instead of numbers and the driveways were longer than our entire street, was where people like the Prescotts lived. The East Side was where the money was, old money that had been in Fairfield for generations, new money that had come from founding companies or making smart investments, or inheriting wealth from relatives who'd done those things. The houses there were massive, set back from the road behind walls or gates or elaborate landscaping, each one situated on multiple acres. Like the land itself was something to be consumed and displayed. They had circular driveways and 3-car garages and swimming pools and tennis courts and rooms designated for specific purposes that seemed absurd to someone from my world. A room just for wrapping gifts, a room just for wine storage, a room just for displaying trophies and awards, a room just for the kids to practice music. These weren't houses in the normal sense. They were compounds, estates, physical manifestations of wealth so excessive it had to invent new ways to express itself. My mother had been cleaning houses since I was 8 years old. She'd started with one client, a referral from a friend at the restaurant where she'd been waiting tables, and slowly built up her business through word of mouth and reliability, and the kind of competence that made wealthy people willing to trust her alone in their houses. By the time my father left, she had 4 regular clients and was making more money from cleaning than she'd ever made from waitressing, though it came at the cost of her body. The work was physically brutal, hours spent scrubbing and vacuuming and bending and lifting and reaching, her knees aching from kneeling on hard floors, her back straining from the constant movement, her hands dry and cracked from the chemicals and cleaning products. She was only 37 when my father left, but she moved like someone older, her body already showing the accumulated damage of years spent making other people's spaces pristine. After my father left, she doubled her client list. She had to. His income, minimal as it had been, had covered about 40% of our expenses. Without it, we were underwater immediately, facing eviction and utility shutoffs, and all the cascading crises that happen when poor people lose income. Within 2 weeks, she'd added 2 new clients. Within a month, she had 6 families. She cleaned for, working Monday through Saturday with only Sundays off, leaving the house at 2 in the afternoon and not returning until 8 or 9 at night, eating cold sandwiches in her car between jobs because she didn't have time to stop for real meals. I knew all their schedules by heart because mine revolved around hers. Monday was the Hawthorns, a retired couple in their 70s whose house was pristine except for the dust that accumulated because they spent half the year in Florida. Tuesday was the Ridgeways, a doctor and a lawyer with 3 kids who created chaos my mother had to systematically eliminate. Wednesday was Mrs. Northfield, a widow whose house was too big for one person, but who refused to move because her late husband had built it. Thursday was the Prescotts, which I'll get to later because that's where everything changed. Friday was the Merricks, new money from tech, young parents who apologized constantly for their mess while making new messes. Saturday rotated between 2 families who needed help monthly instead of weekly. I knew when she'd be home, knew when she'd be exhausted, knew which houses were easy and which ones left her too tired to make dinner. Before everything happened, before Brandon Prescott made me famous for all the wrong reasons, I was just a kid trying to be invisible in the particular way that poor kids learn to be invisible in spaces dominated by wealth. I wasn't popular. That would have required clothes and confidence and the kind of easy social competence that comes from security. But I wasn't a complete outcast either. I existed in that middle zone, where you have a few friends who are similarly situated, where you eat lunch without sitting alone, where you move through hallways without attracting attention, either positive or negative. It's a delicate position to maintain, requiring constant vigilance about what you say, what you wear, how you present yourself, always aware that one misstep could send you tumbling down into the category of people who get noticed for being poor, rather than just quietly being poor without acknowledgement. The apartment itself was small, but we'd made it work. My bedroom was barely big enough for a twin bed and a small desk I'd assembled from IKEA parts. The walls thin enough that I could hear our neighbors' conversations and arguments and television shows. My mother's room was slightly larger but dominated by the queen bed that was the only piece of furniture my father hadn't taken or sold before leaving. The living room and kitchen were one open space, divided by a counter that was coming loose from the wall, no matter how many times my mother tried to fix it. The carpet was brown, industrial grade, stained in ways that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. The bathroom had a shower that only produced lukewarm water, and a sink that dripped constantly, a rhythmic drip, drip, drip that I'd learned to tune out but that visitors always commented on. But, despite its limitations, it was home. My mother kept it immaculately clean, applying the same standards she used in the houses she cleaned to our small space, making sure everything was orderly and maintained even if it was old and worn. She'd hung curtains she'd sewn herself, put plants on the windowsills, arranged our limited furniture in ways that made the space feel intentional rather than just poor. She had a specific way of folding towels and arranging dishes and organizing the refrigerator that brought order to our chaos, that created a sense of control in a life that felt increasingly out of control. I had 3 friends at Fairfield High before everything happened. Not a lot, but enough to feel connected to something, enough to have people to sit with at lunch and occasionally hang out with on weekends when my schedule allowed. There was Dennis Latimer, who I'd known since elementary school, a skinny kid with glasses who was obsessed with computers and video games and who'd taught me basic HTML when we were 12. There was Scott Radcliffe, whose father worked maintenance at the county office building, a quiet guy who loved basketball even though he was only 5'7" and had about as much chance of making the team as I did. And there was Justin Hawthorne, who people assumed came from money because of his last name, but who actually lived in the same apartment complex we did, 3 buildings over. His connection to the wealthy Hawthornes purely coincidental. We weren't close in the way that kids from stable families are close. Didn't have sleepovers or long phone conversations or deep emotional bonds. But we understood each other's situations without having to discuss them, recognized in each other the same careful navigation of social spaces, the same awareness of what we couldn't afford to do or buy or be. We ate lunch together at a table near the windows in the cafeteria, usually bringing food from home, because the school lunch cost $3.50, and that money was better spent elsewhere. We played pickup basketball on the outdoor courts after school sometimes, treating it as social time rather than actual sports, since none of us had the skill or training to be competitive. We borrowed each other's homework when we'd been too tired or busy to complete it. A mutual aid system that kept all of us barely passing classes we might otherwise have failed. I played some basketball in my limited free time, though I was never good enough to make the actual team and knew better than to try out and face the public rejection that would come from failing. I was decent at math, not because I had any natural talent for it, but because math was objective and clear and didn't require the kind of creative thinking or extensive reading that English and history demanded. I was terrible at English, constantly struggling with essays and analysis and all the subjective interpretation that I never quite understood. Why did it matter what the author meant if what they wrote was clear? Why did we need to analyze symbolism when the story made sense without it? I never asked these questions out loud because I knew they'd mark me as someone who didn't understand education, but they bothered me constantly. I had a reputation for falling asleep in afternoon classes, especially during 5th period, which started at 1:15 and was usually history or English. Teachers would call on me to answer questions, and I'd jolt awake, disoriented and embarrassed, having no idea what we'd been discussing. Some teachers were kind about it, would move on without comment, recognizing that my exhaustion was probably not just laziness. Others made examples of me, using my tiredness as a teaching moment about responsibility and priorities, and making good choices, never considering that maybe I was making the only choices available to me. The sleep issues weren't because I was lazy or didn't care about school. They were because I'd been up until 2 or 3 in the morning helping my mother clean the Hawthorne estate or the Merrick house, or whichever of her clients had needed extra work that week. I'd started helping her when I was 12, initially just carrying supplies and holding trash bags and doing simple tasks that made her work go faster. But as I got older and she got more tired and her body started really breaking down from the labor, I started doing actual cleaning work. By 15, I could clean a bathroom to her exacting standards, could vacuum without missing corners, could dust without leaving streaks, could mop floors so they shined. We worked well together once I learned her systems, moving through houses with an efficiency born from necessity because time was money, and the faster we finished one house, the sooner we could get to the next or get home to rest. Nobody knew about the cleaning work. That was the rule my mother had established early on, the non-negotiable boundary she insisted we maintain. We keep our dignity, she'd say, as if dignity was something you could preserve by keeping secrets, as if the work itself was shameful rather than just necessary. What we do to survive is nobody's business. I understood her logic even if I didn't fully agree with it. She'd seen what happened to other kids whose parents worked service jobs that were visible in the community, how they got treated, how they got labeled, how their opportunities narrowed because people made assumptions about their capabilities based on their parents' work. She wanted better for me, or at least she wanted me to have a chance at better before the world decided what I was worth based on what she did to pay rent. She was trying to protect me, trying to give me a fair shot at navigating high school without the additional burden of being the maid's son. And for a while, it worked. I was just another kid from the West Side, poor but not remarkably so, unremarkable in most ways, flying under the radar. It was a delicate position to maintain, requiring constant vigilance about what I said and what I revealed and how I presented myself. I couldn't talk about being tired because that might lead to questions about why. I couldn't mention my mother's work because that would break the rule. I couldn't explain why I couldn't hang out on Thursday afternoons or Saturday mornings because that would reveal the schedule. I had to construct a version of myself that was plausible but incomplete, honest enough to not feel like lying, but vague enough to protect the secret we were keeping. Looking back now, I realize how much energy that took, how exhausting it was to constantly monitor what I revealed, to maintain that performance of normalcy. But at the time it just felt necessary, felt like the price of maintaining my position in the social hierarchy, felt like what everyone probably did to some degree, because nobody shows their full self in high school. Fairfield High School was a microcosm of the town itself, all the divisions and hierarchies and unspoken rules compressed into one building with 3 floors and about 800 students. The kids from the east side arrived in cars that cost more than some houses, drove BMWs and Audis and luxury SUVs that their parents had bought them for their 16th birthdays. They wore clothes that looked casual but cost hundreds of dollars, brands I recognized from seeing them in the houses my mother cleaned. Everything from Vineyard Vines and Patagonia and Ralph Lauren, clothes designed to signal wealth while pretending not to. They moved through the hallways with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about whether the lights would stay on at home, or whether there would be enough money for groceries, or whether your mother's car would break down and leave you without transportation. Then there were kids like me and my friends, who took the bus that picked us up at 6:45 every morning and dropped us off by the apartment complex at 4 in the afternoon. We wore the same rotation of outfits week after week, clothes from Target or Walmart or thrift stores, chosen for durability and cheapness rather than style. We brought lunch from home or didn't eat lunch at all, calculating whether we could afford to buy something from the vending machines or needed to save that $1.50 for something more important. We didn't join clubs or do extracurriculars because most of them cost money for uniforms or equipment or trips, and even the ones that were technically free required time we didn't have because we had jobs or family responsibilities or both. The school tried to pretend these divisions didn't exist, that we were all just students, all equal, all having the same educational experience. They talked about opportunity and potential and how hard work would be rewarded. But equality is a lie when some kids spend spring break in Europe and others spend it hoping their mother's car doesn't break down because there's no money for repairs. Equality is a lie when some kids have tutors and test prep and college counselors, and others are just trying to stay awake in class. Equality is a lie when the same C grade means completely different things depending on whether you have safety nets or are one bad month away from homelessness. Nobody knew about the cleaning. That was the rule my mother had established early on. We keep our dignity, she'd say, as if dignity was something you could preserve by keeping secrets. What we do to survive is nobody's business. I understood her logic. She'd seen what happened to other kids whose parents worked service jobs, how they got treated, how they got labeled. She wanted better for me, or at least she wanted me to have a chance at better before the world decided what I was worth. Fairfield High School was a microcosm of the town itself. The kids from the east side arrived in cars that cost more than some houses. They wore clothes that looked casual but cost hundreds of dollars, and they moved through the hallways with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about whether the lights would stay on at home. Then there were kids like me, who took the bus, who wore the same rotation of outfits week after week, who calculated whether they could afford to buy lunch or needed to save the money for something else. The school tried to pretend these divisions didn't exist, that we were all just students, all equal. But equality is a lie when some kids spend spring break in Europe and others spend it hoping their mother's car doesn't break down because there's no money for repairs. Brandon Prescott was East Side royalty. Sophomore year, same as me, but he might as well have been from a different planet. His father owned Prescott Development, the company responsible for half the commercial real estate in 3 counties. His mother came from old money, the kind of wealth that didn't need to prove itself because everyone already knew. Brandon had the face and build of someone who'd never missed a meal, never worried about anything more serious than which college would be lucky enough to accept him. He played varsity soccer as a sophomore, dated a senior named Natalie Ridgway, who looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog, and had a circle of friends who orbited him like planets around the sun. I knew who Brandon was the way everyone knew who Brandon was. You couldn't attend Fairfield High and not know the Prescott name. But he didn't know I existed, and that was exactly how I wanted it. My mother had been cleaning the Prescott estate for 3 years by then, every Monday and Thursday afternoon from 2 to 6. She'd told me about the house, described its size, its excess, the room that was just for wrapping gifts, the garage that held 5 cars. She'd mentioned the family in passing, always professionally, never judgmentally, though I could hear the weariness in her voice when she talked about how much space 2 people and 1 teenage boy needed. I'd helped my mother clean houses since I was 12. At first it was just carrying supplies, holding trash bags, simple tasks that made her work go faster. But as I got older and she got more tired, I started doing actual work. By 15, I could clean a bathroom to her exacting standards, could vacuum without missing corners, could dust without leaving streaks. We worked well together, moving through houses with an efficiency born from necessity. Time was money, and the faster we finished one house, the sooner we could get to the next. That October, my mother's back went out. Not dramatically, not with some obvious injury, but gradually, the way bodies fail when you push them too hard for too long. She woke up one Thursday and couldn't bend without pain shooting down her left leg. She cried, not from the pain, but from the panic of potentially losing work, losing income, losing the fragile stability we'd built. I was the one who suggested I go to the Prescott house in her place. I was the one who said I knew the routine, could handle it alone, that the Prescotts probably wouldn't even be home. She resisted at first, worried about what it would look like, a 15-year-old boy cleaning alone. But I convinced her. I'd done it before at other houses when she was sick. I knew what I was doing. The Prescott estate sat at the end of Ashbury Lane, behind gates that opened automatically when you entered the code. The driveway curved through landscaped grounds that required a full-time gardener. The house itself was a modern colonial, all white columns and huge windows, the kind of place that appeared in magazines about architectural excellence. My mother had given me the key and the alarm code, along with detailed instructions about what needed to be done. I arrived at 2:15, parked my mother's old sedan in the service area behind the house where it wouldn't be visible from the main approach, and let myself in through the side door that led to the mudroom. The house was silent in a way that only empty, wealthy houses are silent. Not peaceful, but expectant, as if the space itself was waiting for its owners to return and fill it with purpose. I'd been in enough of these houses to not be impressed anymore, but the Prescott place still made me feel small. The kitchen alone was larger than our entire apartment, all granite counters and stainless steel appliances that gleamed because my mother polished them twice a week. I put on the uniform my mother wore, a simple gray polo with reliable home services embroidered on the chest, and got to work. I started with the kitchen, the way my mother always did. Wiped down all the surfaces, cleaned the sink until it shone, swept and mopped the floor. Then I moved to the main living areas, dusting, vacuuming, straightening. The Prescotts weren't messy people, but they also weren't tidy. They left things where they fell. Coffee cups on side tables, magazines spread across ottomans, shoes kicked off by doorways, all the small evidences of people who knew someone else would pick up after them. I worked methodically, room by room, losing myself in the routine. There was something almost meditative about cleaning when you were good at it, when you knew exactly what needed to be done and could shut off your mind and just move through the motions. I was in the garage, mopping the floor where someone had tracked in mud, when I heard the door from the kitchen open. I looked up and there was Brandon Prescott, home early from whatever Thursday afternoon activity he'd been at, stopping dead in his tracks as he saw me. For a moment we just stared at each other, and I watched his expression cycle through confusion, recognition, and something else. Not disgust exactly, but a kind of dawning awareness, as if he'd just discovered something he shouldn't have seen. "What are you doing here, Call?" he asked, and his tone wasn't aggressive, just genuinely confused. I straightened up, still holding the mop, acutely aware of how I must look in the gray uniform, surrounded by cleaning supplies in his garage. "Filling in for my mother," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "She's not feeling well." His eyes narrowed slightly, and I saw the moment he placed me. "You go to Fairfield," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "What's your name?" I told him, and watched him file it away, his expression unreadable. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and I knew with absolute certainty that this moment was going to change everything. He didn't say anything else, just nodded once and walked back into the house. I finished mopping, packed up the supplies, and left. My mother asked how it went, and I lied. "Fine," I said. Nobody was home. The next day at school, I knew immediately that something had changed. People were looking at me differently, not quite staring, but aware of me in a way they hadn't been before. I felt it in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in the classroom before first period started. It was like the air pressure had changed, like everyone knew something I was about to find out. I made it until lunch before Kyle Fairfax, one of Brandon's friends, came up to me in the cafeteria line and said, "Hey, is it true your mom cleans Brandon's house?" The cafeteria wasn't silent, but it got quieter. Conversations didn't stop, but they got lower, people leaning in to hear what I would say. I looked at Kyle, then past him to where Brandon sat with his usual group, and Brandon was watching, his expression neutral, but his posture indicating he'd told them to do this, to confirm what he'd seen, to make it public. "Yeah," I said, because there was no point in lying. "She cleans houses, that's her job." Kyle nodded slowly, processing this. "That's cool," he said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but cool. "Hard work, if ya swite," walked away, and the moment passed, but the damage was done. By the end of the day, everyone knew. Not because there was some dramatic announcement, not because Brandon stood up in the cafeteria and declared my secret, but because information in high school moves like water, finding every crack, seeping into every space. By the time I got home, I'd heard it muttered in bathroom stalls, whispered between classes, discussed in the parking lot. The maid's son. That's what they were calling me, the maid's son. My mother noticed something was wrong at dinner. I'd always been good at hiding things from her, at protecting her from the parts of my life that might worry her. But that night, I couldn't keep my face neutral. She asked what happened, and I told her. Told her about Brandon coming home early, about being seen, about everyone at school knowing now. I watched her face close down, watched her retreat into that place she went when the world hurt her and she couldn't show it. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and those two words broke something in me. She was apologizing, as if her work, her survival, her keeping us housed and fed was something to be ashamed of. "Don't," I said, harder than I meant to. "You don't have anything to apologize for." But she did apologize again and again over the following weeks, as the situation at school deteriorated and she saw what it was doing to me. Because being known as the maid's son wasn't just embarrassing, it was transformative. It changed how teachers saw me, how students treated me, how I moved through spaces that I'd previously navigated without incident. The kids from the West Side didn't know what to do with this information. Some of them were sympathetic. Their own parents worked similar jobs. But they also kept their distance, as if my sudden visibility might somehow expose them too. The East Side kids treated me with a mixture of pity and contempt, and somehow the pity was worse. Brandon himself didn't bully me. Not directly, he didn't need to. He'd set something in motion and now he could just watch it unfold. His friends did the work for him. Kyle Fairfax made comments about whether my mother had cleaned his house too, about whether I could give him a discount. Anthony Merrick asked if I'd found any interesting things while snooping through people's houses. They were always phrased as jokes, always delivered with smiles, so if I reacted badly, I'd be the one who couldn't take a joke, who was too sensitive, who had a chip on his shoulder. I learned to not react, to keep my face blank, to let their words slide off me like I didn't care. But I cared. Of course I cared. I was 15 years old, and every day I had to walk through hallways, knowing that everyone was thinking about my mother on her hands and knees, scrubbing toilets in their houses. I cared when teachers started calling on me less, their expectations visibly lowering now that they knew I was from that kind of family. I cared when the girl I'd been working up the courage to talk to, Melanie Stratton, started avoiding eye contact with me in the hallways. I cared when my few friends started finding excuses to not hang out, as if my new reputation might be contagious. The worst part, the part that I've never fully processed even now, was how quickly people accepted this new version of me. It was as if the information about my mother's work had simply confirmed what they'd always suspected, had validated their subconscious categorizations. Of course I fell asleep in class. I was up all night cleaning. Of course I wore the same clothes repeatedly. I couldn't afford new ones. Of course I was mediocre at everything. What did you expect from the maid's son? Every aspect of who I'd been before got reinterpreted through this new lens, and the person I'd thought I was disappeared, replaced by this character they'd created, this role they needed me to fill. I started skipping classes, not all of them. I wasn't that stupid, but enough that I started getting called to the guidance counselor's office. Mrs. Northfield was a kind woman who genuinely seemed to care, but her caring was filtered through assumptions that made it useless. She talked about the challenges of my situation, about resources available for students from difficult backgrounds, about how I shouldn't let my circumstances define my potential. She meant well, but every word reinforced the same message. You are less than, you are disadvantaged, you are limited by where you come from. She never asked if I was okay, if something had happened, if there was a specific problem I needed help with. She just assumed my struggles were inevitable, built into the fabric of who I was. 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident, I walked into school to find people clustered around phones, watching something and laughing. At first I thought it was another viral video, some celebrity doing something stupid, the usual content that circulated. Then I heard my name and my stomach dropped. Someone thrust their phone in my face, and I saw myself on the screen, in the Prescott garage, mopping the floor in that gray uniform. The video was short, maybe 20 seconds, shot from a high angle like Brandon had been standing on the stairs that led from the garage to the house. The caption read, "Future Nobody." The video had been posted to Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, every platform Brandon was on, and it had spread through the school overnight. I stood in that hallway, watching myself clean on a dozen different screens, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not rage, not yet. What I felt was colder than rage, more permanent. It was a kind of crystallization, a hardening of resolve that I hadn't known I was capable of. Because the video wasn't just humiliating, it was strategic. Brandon had recorded me without my knowledge, had waited weeks to deploy it, had chosen the exact moment when it would do maximum damage. This wasn't casual cruelty. This was calculated, deliberate, a move made by someone who understood power and how to wield it. I didn't go to class that day. I walked out of the school, walked for hours through neighborhoods I barely knew, trying to process what had just happened. The video itself wasn't the worst part, though it was bad enough. The worst part was what it represented. Absolute vulnerability. Brandon had been in his house, watching me work, and instead of letting the moment pass, he documented it, saved it, waited for the perfect time to weaponize it. And there was nothing I could do about it. I couldn't fight back without making it worse. I couldn't complain without seeming weak. I couldn't even be angry without proving I was everything they thought I was. Poor, powerless, pathetic. When I got home that afternoon, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her, and I knew she'd seen the video. Someone had sent it to her, probably one of her clients, kids, because cruelty isn't limited to teenagers. She looked at me with such profound sadness that I almost broke down right there. Almost. But I didn't. I sat down across from her and told her it was fine, that I didn't care, that it would blow over. We both knew I was lying, but we needed the lie. Needed to pretend that this wasn't as devastating as it felt. "I can quit the Prescotts," she said quietly. "I'll call tomorrow and tell them we can't work for them anymore." "No," I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended. "Don't do that. We need the money. We'll manage without them." "We won't." I was 15, and I already knew our financial situation better than most adults knew theirs. I knew exactly how much my mother made from each client, knew which bills got paid when, knew how close we were to the edge every single month. The Prescotts were her highest-paying client. We couldn't afford to lose them, and Brandon knew it. That's why he'd felt safe posting the video. He knew we couldn't retaliate, couldn't make him face consequences, because we needed his family's money to survive. The video was still circulating a week later, then 2 weeks. It had taken on a life of its own, shared beyond our school to other districts, becoming one of those pieces of content that people forwarded without thinking about the real person in it. I became a meme, essentially. The caption, "Future Nobody," got applied to other contexts, other situations, became shorthand for someone failing or struggling or just existing in a way that others found amusing. I watched myself become a joke that would outlive high school, that would exist on the internet forever, searchable and shareable and permanent. The bullying intensified after the video. Before, it had been passive, exclusionary, people avoiding me or making occasional comments. Now it was active. Someone put a mop and bucket in my locker with a note that said, "In case you need to clean up after yourself." Someone else created a fake Instagram account called The Help and started posting fake quotes attributed to me about cleaning rich people's houses. The account gained followers, got engagement, became popular enough that the school had to get involved. They shut down the account, called an assembly about cyberbullying, made vague statements about respect and dignity, but they never named names, never held anyone accountable, and the message was clear. This was my problem to deal with, not theirs to solve. My grades started slipping. Not catastrophically. I'd always been too afraid of failure to completely give up, but noticeably. Teachers who'd previously seen potential in me started writing me off. I could see it in their eyes, the way they'd call on me less frequently, the way they'd accept mediocre work without pushing me to do better. I was fulfilling their lowered expectations, becoming the struggling student they'd assumed I'd always been. The few friends I'd had drifted away, completely, not because they were cruel, but because being associated with me had social costs they weren't willing to pay. I started spending more time at the public library. It was quiet there, anonymous, a place where nobody knew who I was or what had happened to me. I'd sit in the computer section, ostensibly doing homework, but mostly just escaping. One afternoon, I was browsing aimlessly when I stumbled across a forum about computer repair. My father, before he'd left, had worked fixing electronics, and I had inherited some basic knowledge from watching him work. The forum was discussing a common laptop problem, a hardware issue that people were paying hundreds of dollars to fix when the actual solution was a $20 part and 30 minutes of work. I spent that evening reading through the forum, following links, learning terminology I'd never encountered. I went back the next day, and the next, falling into a rabbit hole of technical knowledge that felt like discovering a secret language. Within a week, I was reading about circuit boards and power supplies and diagnostic protocols. Within 2 weeks, I'd ordered a broken laptop off eBay for $15 and a repair kit for another $20, using money I'd saved from helping my mother. Within a month, I'd fixed the laptop and sold it for $130. It wasn't about the money, though the money helped. It was about competence, about having a skill that existed outside of school, outside of the social hierarchy that had crushed me, outside of everything that made me feel worthless. When I was fixing electronics, I wasn't the maid's son. I wasn't future nobody. I was just someone solving problems, someone who knew things, someone who could take something broken and make it work again. I started fixing laptops and phones for people in our apartment complex. Word spread that I was cheap and competent, and soon I had a steady stream of small jobs. $20 to replace a phone screen, $50 to clean a virus off a laptop, $30 to restore a tablet that wouldn't turn on. I learned by doing, by making mistakes and figuring out how to fix them, by reading forums and watching YouTube videos, and reverse engineering solutions when the standard approaches didn't work. My mother thought it was a hobby, a distraction from what was happening at school. She didn't realize it was becoming my lifeline, the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. School became something I endured rather than participated in. I showed up because I had to, because dropping out would mean giving up completely, but I was present in body only. I sat in the back of classrooms, turned in enough work to pass, but never enough to excel, avoided eye contact in hallways, ate lunch in the bathroom or the library. I became invisible again, but this time by choice, by design. If people couldn't see me, they couldn't hurt me. If I didn't try, I couldn't fail. I was protecting myself the only way I knew how, by retreating so completely that there was nothing left exposed for them to attack. Brandon Prescott moved on to other victims, other targets. By junior year, I wasn't interesting anymore. The video was old news, the joke had run its course, and high school's short attention span had found new sources of entertainment. Occasionally, someone would remember, would make a comment or a reference, but the active campaign had ended. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't, because the damage wasn't in the active bullying, it was in the permanent recategorization. I was still the maid's son, I was still future nobody. The difference was that now people didn't bother mentioning it because it was just accepted fact, background information that didn't need to be spoken. My mother lost 3 clients that year, not because of anything she did wrong, but because of rumors that had spread from the video, implications that she or I might steal or snoop or somehow violate the trust of the families she worked for. The Prescotts kept her, which should have felt like mercy, but felt more like power, like they were demonstrating that they could destroy us or spare us at their whim. My mother never complained, never spoke negatively about any of her clients, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she moved slower, the way her back hurt more often. She was getting older, and the work was getting harder, and the money wasn't enough. I was 17, midway through junior year, when I had my first major strategic mistake. A kid in my computer repair network, Dennis Latimer, told me about a bulk lot of broken iPhones he could get cheap from someone who worked at a phone repair shop. The idea was we'd buy them, fix them, sell them for profit. It seemed reasonable, a way to scale up from individual repairs to actual business. I'd saved almost $3,000 from my repair work over the past year and a half, and I put in $2,000 of it, with Dennis putting in the other $1,000. We bought 90 phones and spent 2 weeks fixing them in his garage, only to discover that half of them were carrier locked in ways that we couldn't bypass, and another quarter had hardware issues that were too expensive to fix profitably. We managed to sell maybe 20 phones before the bottom fell out of the market, and we lost everything. I lost $2,000 in one bad decision, and the loss nearly broke me. Not because of the money itself, though that hurt, but because I'd thought I was smarter than I was, had thought I'd found a shortcut, had let optimism override caution. I'd made the exact mistake I'd promised myself I'd never make, the mistake of thinking I could get ahead quickly, that I could skip steps, that I deserved better than the slow grind I'd been doing. It was a brutal lesson in the difference between competence and wisdom, between knowing how to fix phones and knowing how to run a business. I stopped doing repairs for a while after that. Stopped doing much of anything except going through the motions at school and helping my mother when she needed me. I fell into a depression that I didn't have words for, a heaviness that made everything feel pointless. What was I working toward? Even if I graduated high school, I couldn't afford college. Even if I could afford college, I'd be so far behind kids like Brandon Prescott, kids who had tutors and connections and family money, that the competition was already over before it started. I was going to end up like my mother, working too hard for too little, my body breaking down before I was 40, my life measured in the houses I cleaned and the bills I managed to pay. Senior year started, and I was numb to it. I'd given up on the idea that high school meant anything, that it was preparation for some better future. It was just time I had to serve, days I had to survive until I could escape into whatever kind of adulthood would accept me. I took the minimum, required classes, worked enough to pass, stayed invisible. Brandon Prescott was applying to Ivy League schools, planning a future that probably included running his father's company or starting his own venture, living a life so far removed from mine that we might as well have been different species. I was supposed to be defeated. I was supposed to accept my place, understand my limits, appreciate the small mercies of my existence. And for a long time I did. I let them win. I let Brandon Prescott and everyone who'd laughed at that video and everyone who'd lowered their expectations define who I was and what I could become. I became future nobody, not because I wanted to, but because fighting seemed impossible, because the gap between where I was and where I wanted to be was too vast to imagine crossing. But something strange happens when you hit bottom and stay there long enough. You start to realize that there's nowhere lower to go, that the worst has already happened, that you've survived what you thought would destroy you. And in that realization, there's a kind of freedom. Because if you're already nothing, if you've already lost, then there's no risk in trying again. There's no humiliation in failure, because you're already humiliated. There's no shame in aiming high, because you're already at the bottom. It was November of senior year when I started teaching myself to code, not because I thought it would lead anywhere meaningful, not because I had some grand vision of becoming a programmer, but because I was bored and the library had free internet, and I'd exhausted everything I could learn about hardware repair from online forums and YouTube videos. I'd been fixing broken laptops and phones for almost 2 years by then, had gotten pretty good at diagnosis and repair, could replace screens and hard drives and batteries with reasonable efficiency, but hardware repair had limits. You could only get so good at it before you hit a ceiling determined by the physical nature of the work, and more importantly, it required inventory and parts and capital I didn't have. Every repair required spending money on components before I could make money fixing the device, which meant I was constantly cycling my limited funds through parts suppliers, always one broken phone away from losing everything. Software was different. Software could be built with nothing but time and a computer and the willingness to fail repeatedly until you figured it out. I started with Python because every beginner tutorial on the internet recommended it, said it was the most accessible language for people with no programming background. The library had computers anyone could use, and while you couldn't install software on them, you could access web-based development environments that let you write and run code directly in the browser. I started working through a free tutorial called Learn Python the Hard Way, which, despite the intimidating name, was actually pretty straightforward if you were willing to type out every example and actually run them to see what they did. The first programs I wrote were laughably simple. Print "Hello World" to the screen, accept user input and print it back, add 2 numbers together, calculate the area of a circle given its radius, baby steps, the kind of thing that would bore someone who already knew how to program but felt like magic to me, because I was making the computer do things I told it to do, creating behavior through nothing but text in a specific format. There was something deeply satisfying about the cause and effect relationship, the immediate feedback loop of writing code, running it, seeing results, fixing errors, running it again. It was so different from school, where you turned in work and waited days or weeks for a grade, and had to trust that someone else would tell you if you were right or wrong. I spent that entire winter break programming 8 to 10 hours a day. My mother thought I was finally developing a hobby that didn't involve taking apart electronics in our apartment. Didn't realize I was actually learning to fix problems at a level of abstraction that hardware repair never reached. I worked through the Python tutorial, then started a JavaScript course, then began learning about HTML and CSS to understand how websites worked. I built stupid little programs that calculated compound interest, or converted temperatures between Fahrenheit and Celsius, or simulated dice rolls for games. None of it was useful, but all of it was teaching me how to think in code, how to break problems down into component parts, how to build solutions from basic building blocks. The logic appealed to me in a way nothing else in school ever had. Programming was like math, but more forgiving, more creative, more immediately applicable. You didn't just solve for X, you decided what X should be, and how to calculate it, and what to do with the result. And unlike the subjective nightmare of English essays where teachers could disagree about interpretation, code either worked or it didn't. There was no ambiguity, no room for different opinions about correctness. The computer ran your program and either produced the expected output, or it crashed, or it did something unexpected. And in every case you could figure out why and fix it. No judgment, no social penalty for failure, just you and the problem and the solution you built. I was terrible at it initially. My first attempts at anything beyond simple tutorials were clumsy, inefficient, barely functional. I'd spend hours debugging programs that experienced developers could have written in minutes, making every possible mistake, learning the hard way about syntax errors and logic errors and the thousand ways code could fail. But programming has this beautiful quality where you get immediate feedback, where you can see your mistakes instantly and fix them and see the results of your fixes. It's a tight feedback loop that accelerates learning if you're willing to embrace the frustration of constant failure. By the time second semester of senior year started, I was writing code that was actually decent, actually useful beyond just learning exercises. I understood variables and functions and loops and conditionals, could work with lists and dictionaries, could read and write files, could make API calls to web services. I started freelancing on platforms like Upwork and Fiverr, bidding on small programming jobs that paid $30 or $40 for tasks that took me a few hours. At first, I lost most of the bids because I had no reputation and my portfolio was non-existent, but I eventually figured out to bid low enough that clients would take a chance on me, then deliver work good enough that they'd leave positive reviews. My first freelance job was writing a Python script that would scrape product prices from e-commerce websites and compile them into a spreadsheet. The client paid $50 for something that took me about 6 hours to figure out, including learning how to use the web scraping libraries I needed. In purely economic terms, it was terrible, about $8 an hour, but it was $8 an hour I'd earned with my brain instead of my body, $8 that came from skills I'd taught myself, $8 that proved this was something real I could do. I completed the job, got my first 5-star review, and immediately bid on 10 more similar projects. Over the next few months, I built a reputation on the freelancing platforms, accumulated positive reviews, slowly increased my rates from $30 a job to $50 to $75. I wasn't making significant money, maybe $200 a month, but it was money that came from a different place than hardware repair, money that represented a different kind of value. When I fixed a broken phone, I was trading my time and access to parts for cash in a direct transaction. When I wrote code, I was building something that could potentially be reused, scaled, improved, something that existed independently of my physical presence. I should have been focusing on college applications, on SAT prep, on all the things senior year students were supposed to care about if they wanted to escape their circumstances through education. But I'd given up on college by then, had done the math, and realized it was impossible. My grades were mediocre, a 2.7 GPA that reflected years of being too tired to excel and too stressed to focus. My SAT scores were fine but not great, 1,180 out of 1,600, good enough for state schools, but not good enough for scholarships that would make them affordable. I had no extracurricular activities worth mentioning, no sports or clubs or volunteer work, or any of the resume-building experiences that colleges valued. And most fundamentally, I had no money. Not for application fees, not for tuition, not for room and board, not for any of it. I researched community college, looked into 2-year programs that might provide some kind of credential without burying me in debt. But even community college cost money I didn't have, and the return on investment seemed questionable at best. A 2-year degree in what? General studies, business, something technical? And even if I completed it, what then? A job that paid slightly more than what I could make fixing phones and writing code independently? The math didn't work. The opportunity cost was too high. The promise of education felt like just another trap designed to keep people like me in our place while extracting what little resources we had. My mother wanted me to apply anyway, wanted me to at least try for community college, to have some kind of backup plan, to not give up on the idea of formal education entirely. We had several difficult conversations about it that winter, her insisting I needed a degree, me trying to explain that I was already building something more valuable than a degree. You need credentials, she'd say. You need something official that proves you know what you're doing. But I was increasingly convinced that the real world didn't care about credentials as much as it cared about what you could actually do, and I could do things that many college graduates couldn't. In March of senior year, I built my first real application, the inventory management tool for small repair shops that I mentioned earlier. I built it because I knew the market intimately, knew exactly what problems shop owners faced, because I'd effectively been running a micro repair business myself for 2 years. Every shop I'd seen or worked with used some combination of paper systems and Excel spreadsheets to track inventory and customer appointments, systems that were error-prone and inefficient and required constant manual updating. What they needed was a simple web application that would let them log parts when they came in, track what got used on which jobs, manage customer contact, information, schedule appointments, and generate basic reports about profitability. I spent 3 weeks building the core functionality, working late into the night after my mother went to bed, teaching myself new technologies as I needed them. I learned how to set up a database, how to create user authentication systems, how to build forms that collected and validated data, how to generate reports from database queries. It was the most complicated thing I'd built up to that point, requiring me to integrate multiple technologies and make them work together seamlessly. I launched it on a free hosting platform, put up a basic landing page explaining what it did, and posted links to it on forums where repair shop owners congregated online. Within 2 weeks, 3 shops had signed up to use it. Not paying, I was offering it completely free just to see if anyone would actually use it. But 3 shops that thought it was valuable enough to trust with their business data. Within a month, I had 12 active users. By April, I had 37 shops using the tool daily, and several of them were asking if there was a paid version with more features like the ability to text customers appointment reminders or integrate with their accounting software. I built the paid version over spring break, added the features they'd requested plus a few more I thought would be valuable, and started charging $20 a month for access. It was absurdly cheap, probably too cheap given the value it provided, but I didn't have any business sense yet, didn't understand pricing or positioning, or any of the strategic considerations that separate successful products from failed ones. I just knew that $20 times however many users I could get was money I'd be making while I slept. Passive income that would compound over time, rather than requiring me to trade hours for dollars. By the time I graduated high school, with my 2.8 GPA and no college plans and a lot of doubts about my future, I had 48 paying customers and was making $960 a month from software I'd built. It was more than I'd ever made from hardware repair in a single month. More than I'd thought possible from something I'd created myself. More than enough to make me believe that maybe, possibly, this could be something real. I graduated high school with a 2.8 GPA and no plan except to keep coding and hope that what I was building would turn into something sustainable. My mother wanted me to apply to community college, to get some kind of degree, to have a backup plan that felt more secure than betting everything on a software tool that $20 a month at a time. But I'd stopped believing in backup plans. Backup plans were for people who could afford to fail safely, who had family money or safety nets or the ability to recover from mistakes without catastrophic consequences. I needed to succeed immediately, needed to build something that would get us permanently out of the apartment complex and away from the constant stress of bills we couldn't quite pay, and the threat of one bad month ending everything. So I took a full-time job at an auto repair shop owned by a guy named Harold Bancroft, who'd been one of my early repair customers. The job paid $14 an hour and was mind-numbingly boring, changing oil and rotating tires and doing basic maintenance work while Harold handled the more complicated repairs. He'd offered me the job after I'd fixed his shop's computer system when it had gotten infected with malware, impressed by both my technical skills and my work ethic. The job was steady income, and more importantly, it came with health insurance, which meant my mother could finally see a doctor about her back, instead of just taking ibuprofen and hoping the pain would eventually go away. I worked the shop from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, then went home and coded until midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning, sleeping 5 or 6 hours before doing it again. It was exhausting but sustainable in the way that things are sustainable when you're 19 and haven't yet learned what burnout feels like. My little inventory management tool was slowly growing, adding users steadily, becoming something more professional than the scrappy first version I'd launched. I taught myself about payment processing security, about data encryption, about privacy regulations and terms of service, and all the boring legal and technical infrastructure that separates hobby projects from actual products that businesses could trust. The tool had started getting attention on industry forums, people sharing it, and recommending it to other shop owners, and with that attention came higher expectations. Users wanted features I hadn't built yet, wanted integrations with accounting software, and payment processors and parts suppliers. They wanted mobile apps so they could manage their shops from their phones. They wanted white labeling options so they could brand it as their own system. I started keeping a list of feature requests, prioritizing them based on how many users asked for them and how valuable they seemed. I worked the shop during the day and coded at night. My little inventory management tool was slowly growing, adding users, adding features, becoming something more professional than the scrappy first version. I taught myself about payment processing, about data security, about all the boring infrastructure that separates hobby projects from actual products. I raised the price to $35 a month and expected to lose users, but I only lost 3. The others stayed, and new ones kept signing up. And by my 19th birthday, I was making over $2,000 a month from software, while making another $2,400 from the auto shop. I moved my mother out of the apartment complex that fall. Not to anywhere fancy, just a small 2-bedroom house on the west side that we could actually rent without fear of eviction. It had a yard, a garage, a kitchen where the stove worked properly. My mother cried when I gave her the keys, cried in a way I'd never seen her cry before, like something she'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. She kept asking how I could afford it, and I showed her the bank statements from the software, explained the business model, walked her through the financials until she understood that this wasn't temporary, wasn't luck, was something sustainable I'd built. She quit 2 of her cleaning clients that winter. Not the Prescotts. We still needed that income, but 2 of the smaller jobs that paid poorly and took a toll on her body. I wanted her to quit them all, to retire completely, but she refused. "I'm not even 50, she said. "I'm not ready to stop working." But I could see the relief in her when she came home at 5 instead of 8, when she had evenings to herself, when she didn't have to choose between rest and income. I was 20 when I sold the inventory management tool. Not for millions, not for any amount that would change my life immediately, but for $85,000 to a larger software company that wanted to integrate it into their product suite. I negotiated the sale myself, learning contract law from free legal resources online, making sure I retained rights to use similar code for future projects. The buyer thought they were taking advantage of an inexperienced kid, probably assumed I'd be grateful for whatever they offered. And I was grateful, but I was also careful, made sure every clause protected me, made sure I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. I used $30,000 of that money to pay off the debt my mother had accumulated over the years, the credit card balances and medical bills that had been hanging over her since my father left. I used another $20,000 to buy better equipment, multiple computers, professional software licenses, all the tools I needed to build more sophisticated products. I put $20,000 in savings as a genuine emergency fund, the kind of financial cushion we'd never had. The remaining $15,000 I invested in education, not traditional education, but online courses and books and conferences, paying to learn from people who actually knew what they were doing rather than stumbling through everything on my own. I quit the auto shop and went full-time on software development. It was terrifying, giving up steady income for the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. But the inventory tool had proven that I could build things people would pay for. I just needed to do it again. Bigger, better, more ambitious. I spent 3 months building a project management tool specifically for construction companies, using everything I'd learned from the inventory tool, but making it more sophisticated, more scalable, more professional. I launched it with actual marketing this time, paid ads targeting small to medium contractors, content explaining why they needed digital tools instead of paper and phone calls. The construction tool was my first real success. Within 6 months, I had 200 paying customers at $75 per month. Within a year, I had 500 customers and had raised the price to $95. The revenue was $15,000 a month before expenses, and the expenses were minimal because everything was cloud-based and automated. I was 21 years old and making more money than my mother had ever made, living in the same small house, driving the same old car, but with a bank account that represented security, options, freedom. I hired my first employee that year, a designer named Sonia Hollowell, who made my amateur-looking interfaces into professional products. Then I hired a salesperson, Martin Calder, who knew how to talk to contractors in their language, who could close deals I couldn't because I lacked the social skills and industry credibility. The business grew, not explosively, but steadily, adding customers, adding revenue, adding complexity. I learned about hiring and firing, about managing people, about the difference between building products and building companies. By the time I was 23, I had 8 employees and was generating over $80,000 a month in revenue. I'd started working with lawyers and accountants who helped me structure everything properly, minimize taxes, protect assets. I moved the business out of my house into a small office space, hired a CEO type, Owen Ashbury, who could run the day-to-day operations while I focused on product development. The company wasn't huge, wasn't a unicorn startup, but it was profitable and growing, and mine in a way nothing else had ever been mine. My mother finally retired when I was 24. I'd been pushing her to quit for years, but she'd resisted, insisted she needed to work, needed to feel useful, but her body was done. Her back had gotten worse despite the reduced hours. Her knees were failing. Her hands had arthritis that made gripping cleaning supplies painful. I set her up with a monthly payment that was more than she'd ever made working, made her promise to actually rest, to take care of herself, to stop sacrificing her body for survival. The day she made her last cleaning appointment was the Prescotts, and I made her let me drive her there, wait outside, drive her home afterward. She cried the whole drive home, and I didn't know if it was relief or grief or some combination of both. I kept building companies, sold the construction tool for $2.3 million when I was 25. used the money to start 3 new products simultaneously. One failed completely, one broke even, and one became my first major success. It was a workflow automation tool for professional services firms, law offices and accounting firms and consulting groups. Basically anything where people billed by the hour and needed to track their time and projects. The market was crowded, but I'd built something better, simpler, more intuitive than the legacy systems everyone hated, but kept using because switching was too hard. I made switching easy, built automated migration tools, offered hands-on onboarding, undercut competitor pricing until I had enough market share to raise prices without losing customers. The professional services tool took off in a way nothing I'd built before had. Within 2 years, we had 5,000 customers and were generating over $1 million in monthly revenue. I raised venture capital for the first time, $5 million from a firm that specialized in B2B software, used the money to hire aggressively, build out sales and marketing teams, professionalize everything. The venture capital was a mistake, though I didn't realize it at the time. The investors pushed for growth at all costs, wanted me to expand faster than was sustainable, hire more people than we needed, chase markets we didn't understand. I resisted, but not hard enough, and the company started losing its focus, becoming bloated and inefficient. I fired the CEO they'd pushed me to hire, took back operational control, laid off 30% of the staff, refocused on the core product. The investors were furious, threatened to replace me, but I owned enough of the company that they couldn't, and eventually the numbers proved I'd been right. We grew more slowly but more sustainably, became profitable again, started building value instead of just burning cash. I was 28 when I sold the professional services tool for $42 million. After taxes and paying back investors and distributing shares to employees, I personally cleared $23 million. It was an absurd amount of money, more than I'd ever imagined having, more than I knew what to do with. I could have retired, could have done nothing for the rest of my life except manage investments and pursue hobbies, but I didn't want to retire. I wanted to keep building, keep proving something I could never quite articulate even to myself. I started angel investing, putting money into other people's companies, helping young founders who reminded me of who I'd been at 20. I was good at it, could recognize genuine competence underneath amateur presentation, could tell the difference between people who were serious and people who just liked the idea of being entrepreneurs. I invested in 18 companies over 2 years, with the explicit strategy of writing small checks to people who were underestimated, overlooked, usually because they didn't come from the right backgrounds or schools. 13 of those companies failed, 3 broke even, 2 became successful enough that my early investments were worth substantial amounts. But mostly I built my own companies. Started a SaaS tool for property management that grew to 10,000 customers in 3 years. Started an API service that let small businesses accept payments without dealing with banks directly. Started a data analytics platform for retail companies. Some succeeded, some failed, but I was building a portfolio, creating a network of products and companies that generated revenue and influence. I wasn't trying to build one massive company anymore. I was trying to build an ecosystem, a collection of tools that worked together, that reinforced each other, that created value in multiple markets simultaneously. I moved out of Fairfield when I was 30, not far, just to a city 40 minutes away where there were more entrepreneurs, more people building things, fewer people who remembered who I'd been. I bought a condo downtown, something modern and minimal, a space that felt like mine in a way nowhere else ever had. I didn't furnish it much, didn't collect things, kept it almost empty except for computers and books and the few possessions I actually cared about. My mother thought it was depressing, kept trying to get me to buy furniture or art or something that would make it feel lived in. But I liked the emptiness. It felt honest. My social life was minimal. I had business relationships, people I worked with or invested in or learned from. But I didn't have friends, not really. Didn't date much, didn't go to parties, didn't participate in the social rituals that people my age seemed to care about. Partially it was time. I was working constantly, building constantly, thinking about products and markets and strategies even when I was supposedly relaxing. But partially it was the aftermath of high school, the permanent damage from being humiliated and excluded and labeled. I'd learned to be alone, learned to not need people, learned to find everything I needed in work and achievement, and the satisfaction of building things that worked. I thought about Brandon Prescott occasionally over those years. Not obsessively, not constantly, but sometimes. I'd look him up online, see what he was doing, where he'd ended up. He'd gone to Princeton, studied economics, worked at Goldman Sachs for 2 years before quitting to do something entrepreneurial. I found his LinkedIn, saw the trajectory of privilege playing out exactly as expected. Good school, good job, good connections, everything handed to him or made accessible because of his name and his network. He'd started a company called Northfield Analytics that did something with data and market research. Nothing particularly innovative, just the kind of thing that sounds impressive to people who don't understand the technology. I didn't hate him. That was the strange part. I thought I would, thought I'd carry this burning resentment forever, but mostly I felt nothing. He was just someone from my past, someone who'd hurt me in a way that had seemed catastrophic at the time, but had ultimately been small, temporary, survivable. He'd made me the maid's son, but I'd made myself something else, something he could never understand or touch. The revenge I'd imagined in high school, the scenarios I'd played out in my head of confronting him or exposing him or somehow making him feel what he'd made me feel, all of that had faded. I'd won by becoming someone he could never be, by building something he could never access, by existing in a space where his opinion didn't matter. Or that's what I told myself. That's the story I'd constructed, the narrative that made everything make sense. I'd overcome my circumstances through hard work and intelligence and discipline. I'd turned trauma into motivation, humiliation into fuel, disadvantage into advantage. It was a good story, the kind of story people like to hear, the kind of story that suggests the system works if you just work hard enough. But the truth was more complicated, messier, less satisfying, because I had won by certain metrics, had achieved success that was undeniable and impressive, but I'd also lost the ability to trust people, lost the capacity for genuine connection, lost whatever optimism or naivety I'd had before Brandon Prescott made me famous for being poor. I was 32 when Brandon Prescott called me. Not personally, he didn't have my number, but his assistant called my assistant, requested a meeting, said Brandon was looking for strategic investment in his new venture, and had identified me as a potential partner. I almost declined immediately, almost told my assistant to say I wasn't interested. But something made me pause, made me curious about what would happen if I said yes. Did he know who I was? Did he remember the kid in his garage, the video he'd posted, the maid's son he'd helped create? Or had those years erased me from his memory entirely, turned me into just another anonymous victim of his casual cruelty? I agreed to the meeting. Scheduled it for the following week at my office, a space I'd designed to be subtly intimidating, all glass and metal and views of the city, the kind of place that communicated success without being ostentatious about it. I told my assistant to not mention my background, to keep the introduction minimal, just my name and company affiliations. I wanted to see if he'd recognize me on his own, if my face would trigger any memory of who I'd been. The day of the meeting, I was calm in a way I hadn't expected. I thought I'd be nervous, angry, emotional, but I felt nothing except a kind of clinical curiosity, the same detachment I felt analyzing code or evaluating investment opportunities. Brandon Prescott arrived exactly on time, dressed in the uniform of startup founders everywhere, expensive jeans and a blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd aged well, looked fit and successful and confident, exactly like someone who'd lived a life without real consequences. He walked into my office, extended his hand, introduced himself as if we'd never met. "Brandon Prescott," he said. "Thanks for taking the time." I shook his hand, said my name, watched his face for any sign of recognition. Nothing. He didn't know me, didn't remember me. The kid he'd humiliated so thoroughly that it had defined years of my life was completely absent from his memory. I was just another potential investor, another person with money he needed, another meeting in a schedule full of meetings. We sat down, and he started his pitch. Northfield Analytics had developed a new platform for real-time market sentiment analysis, using social media data and machine learning to predict consumer trends. It was a crowded market, and his pitch wasn't particularly unique, but it was competent. He'd clearly given this presentation many times, had refined it, knew how to highlight the opportunity and minimize the risks. He talked about his team, his technology, his vision for scaling. He talked about the funding he needed, the timeline for growth, the eventual exit strategy. He was professional, articulate, exactly what you'd expect from someone with his background in education. I listened without interrupting, letting him build his case, watching how he performed. He was good at this, I had to admit. Good at selling, good at creating belief, good at making people want to be part of whatever he was building. It was a skill I'd never developed, never needed because I'd built products that sold themselves. But it was valuable, this ability to inspire confidence, to make people see possibility instead of risk. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for questions or objections or whatever response investors typically gave. Instead, I asked about his technology architecture, about how they were processing the social media data, what models they were using for sentiment analysis, how they were handling the computational load. Technical questions that most investors wouldn't ask. Questions that revealed whether the technology was actually sophisticated or just buzzwords hiding simple implementations. He handled the questions well, knew his product, could speak intelligently about the technical details without getting lost in them. His CTO had clearly prepared him, or maybe he actually understood what they'd built. Either way, I was impressed despite myself. The product was real, the technology was solid, and the market opportunity was genuine, even if it wasn't as revolutionary as he was claiming. Then I asked about his team. He walked me through his co-founders, his key employees, their backgrounds and qualifications, Princeton grads, Stanford MBAs, people from Goldman and McKinsey, and all the institutions that produce this particular type of founder. It was exactly the team you'd expect, exactly the network that someone like Brandon would have access to, exactly the privilege that made building companies easier when you came from money. "What about you?" I asked. "What's your background?" He gave me the summary. Princeton economics, 2 years at Goldman, left to do something more meaningful, started Northfield with 2 college friends, raised seed funding, built the product, now looking for Series A. It was the standard trajectory, the path that venture capitalists loved, because it was familiar, safe, proven. Nothing in his story suggested struggle or uncertainty or the kind of desperation that actually drives innovation. just steady progression from one prestigious milestone to the next. And before Princeton, I asked? High school in Fairfield, he said, naming the town like it was just geography, like it didn't mean anything significant. I grew up in Fairfield, I said, keeping my voice neutral. His expression shifted slightly, interest replacing the professional distance. Really? When did you graduate? I told him the year, watched him do the math, realized we would have overlapped. We might have been at Fairfield High at the same time, he said, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, like he was trying to remember if we'd known each other, if we'd been friends or acquaintances or strangers who'd passed in hallways. We were, I said. You probably don't remember me. He looked at me more carefully, studying my face, trying to place me. I could see the effort, the mental sorting through hundreds of classmates, trying to match my adult face to some teenage memory. But there was nothing there. I'd changed too much, or he'd never really seen me in the first place, or the kid in his garage was so far beneath his notice that no amount of success could make that memory accessible. I'm sorry, he said, and he sounded genuinely apologetic. I'm terrible with faces. Did we have classes together? Something like that, I said. Then I asked him to continue the pitch, to tell me about the funding he needed, the terms he was offering, why I should invest in Northfield Analytics instead of the dozens of other companies competing for my capital. He shifted back into pitch mode, talking about valuations and equity and timelines. He wanted $2 million for 15% of the company, which valued Northfield at around $13 million pre-money. It was aggressive, but not unreasonable given their progress and team. He had commitments for half the round already, he said, needed to close the rest in the next month to hit their development timeline. I listened, asked questions, appeared to consider seriously. Then I told him I needed to see more. Technical documentation, customer data, financial projections, everything he had. If I was going to invest $2 million, I needed to understand exactly what I was buying into. He agreed immediately, said his team could prepare everything, asked how quickly I needed it. 2 weeks, I said. Everything you have, product specs, code repositories if you're comfortable sharing them, business plan, financial models, customer contracts, everything. He hesitated at the code repositories, which was understandable. You don't usually share source code with potential investors before they've committed. But I told him I had a technical background, needed to see the actual implementation to evaluate the technology claims. Couldn't make an informed decision without it. After a moment, he agreed. He needed the money badly enough to take the risk, and I had positioned myself as genuinely interested, just thorough. Over the next 2 weeks, his team sent me everything. Gigabytes of documentation, code, data, presentations, contracts. I went through all of it with the kind of obsessive attention I usually reserve for my own products. The technology was legitimate, well built, sophisticated enough to be defensible. But there were weaknesses, places where the architecture could be improved, optimizations that would make it faster and more scalable. I documented everything, built a complete understanding of how their system worked and where the value really lived. The core of their technology was a sentiment analysis algorithm. They'd developed a machine learning model that was trained on specific data sets to predict market movements based on social media activity. The algorithm was good, genuinely innovative in how it weighted different signals and filtered noise, and they'd filed a provisional patent for it, but hadn't completed the full patent application yet. The provisional gave them 12 months of protection while they refined the claims and prepared the formal submission. I found their patent attorney, a small firm in Delaware that specialized in software patents, called them pretending to be a different startup interested in similar work, asked about their process and timeline. learned that Northfield's provisional was set to expire in 4 months, and they hadn't started the formal application yet because they were waiting to gather more data to strengthen the claims. Then I did something I'd spent weeks debating, something I'd told myself I wouldn't do but knew I was always going to do. I hired my own patent attorney, one of the best in the country, someone who specialized in software and machine learning patents. I gave them everything I'd learned about Northfield's algorithm, everything I'd reverse engineered from their code, everything I understood about how it worked, and I told them to file a patent application for a similar but legally distinct implementation of the same concept. The key was timing and precision. Patent law has this concept called prior art, where you can't patent something if someone else has already publicly disclosed it or filed for it. But there are nuances, loopholes, spaces between what seems like it should be protected and what actually is. Northfield's provisional patent was too vague in certain areas, didn't claim certain aspects of the implementation that were actually crucial to making the algorithm work. My attorney identified those gaps, crafted claims that covered the missing pieces, and filed a full patent application that would be processed faster than Northfield's provisional to full conversion. It was legal. Technically barely legal, but absolutely legal. And it was the kind of move that Brandon Prescott would never see coming, because people from his background don't think about being outmaneuvered legally. They think about competition in terms of better products, bigger markets, faster execution. They don't think about someone analyzing their intellectual property, finding the gaps in their protection, and filing around them. I invested in Northfield Analytics, put in the full $2 million for 15% equity, signed all the paperwork, became an active investor with board observation rights. Brandon was thrilled, sent me a bottle of expensive whiskey to celebrate, introduced me to his team as a major supporter and strategic partner. I played the role perfectly, asked good questions in board meetings, made helpful suggestions, connected them with other entrepreneurs in my network. I was the ideal investor, engaged but not micromanaging, supportive but not overbearing. My patent application was filed under a shell company I'd created specifically for intellectual property holdings. The attorney who filed it had no connection to me publicly, no trail that would lead back to my involvement. The application itself was dense and technical, the kind of document that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. It would take months to process, maybe over a year before it was approved. But once it was approved, it would create a legal reality that would fundamentally alter Northfield's position. I spent 6 months being the perfect investor. I helped them recruit engineers, introduced them to potential customers, advised on their product roadmap. I watched Brandon operate, saw how he led his team, how he handled pressure, how he made decisions. He was good at what he did, I had to admit. Not brilliant, not visionary, but competent and confident and effective. He'd built something real with Northfield, something that could actually succeed if everything went right. The provisional patent was set to expire in November. In September, Brandon's team finally started working on the formal application, pulling together all their documentation, refining their claims, preparing for the full submission. They were running late, cutting it close, but they weren't worried. Provisional patents give you 12 months, and they were within that window. They didn't know that my application had been filed months earlier, that it was already being processed, that it covered aspects of their technology they'd assumed were protected. My patent was approved in October. The approval came through faster than expected, partly because I'd paid for expedited processing, partly because the claims were well crafted and didn't have major issues that required revision. The moment I got the approval notice, I called my attorney and had them send a formal letter to Northfield Analytics informing them that their core algorithm infringed on my patent, and they needed to cease using it immediately or negotiate a licensing agreement. The letter arrived at Northfield's office on a Wednesday morning. Brandon called me 3 hours later, his voice tight with confusion and anger. "What the fuck is this?" he said, not even bothering with pleasantries. "You filed a patent on our algorithm?" "Not your algorithm," I said calmly. "A patent on key aspects of sentiment analysis, processing that your algorithm appears to infringe upon. My attorneys reviewed it carefully. The claims are solid." "This is bullshit," he said. "You knew what we were building. You saw our provisional patent. You invested in the company based on this technology." "I invested in Northfield based on the team and market opportunity," I said. "The technology was part of that evaluation, but I conducted independent research into sentiment analysis methods and filed my own intellectual property. That's completely legal and standard practice." He was silent for a moment, and I could hear him breathing, trying to control his anger. "So what do you want? A licensing agreement? More equity? What's the play here?" "I want Northfield to succeed," I said, "but we need to have a conversation about the intellectual property situation. Why don't you come to my office tomorrow? We can discuss terms." He showed up the next morning looking like he hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't. He'd brought his CTO and his attorney, and I'd arranged for my own attorney to be present. We sat in the same conference room where he'd first pitched me, and the dynamic was completely different now. Then he'd been selling and I'd been evaluating. Now I held all the power, and we both knew it. My attorney laid out the situation. My patent covered specific implementations of sentiment weighting and noise filtering that were essential to making real-time social media analysis accurate. Northfield's algorithm used nearly identical implementations, which meant they were infringing. They could fight it in court, spend years and hundreds of thousands of dollars arguing about prior art and obviousness, and all the technical legal concepts that patent disputes involve. Or they could negotiate a licensing agreement that would let them continue using the technology. Brandon's attorney argued that their provisional patent established prior art, that they'd clearly been working on this technology before my patent was filed. But my attorney countered that the provisional was too vague in the relevant areas, didn't actually claim the specific implementations my patent covered. It was a technical argument, the kind of thing that would take expert witnesses and lengthy court proceedings to resolve, and Northfield didn't have the resources for that kind of fight. They'd raised $4 million total, had burned through most of it on development and hiring, didn't have the runway for extended litigation. We went back and forth for 3 hours, Brandon getting increasingly frustrated, his attorney trying to find angles that didn't exist, my attorney calmly explaining why every argument failed. Finally, we broke for the day, agreed to reconvene in a week after they'd had time to fully assess their options. Over the next week, I watched Brandon scramble. He called other investors, tried to raise an emergency funding round to pay for litigation. He consulted with other patent attorneys, looking for someone who would tell him what he wanted to hear. He even tried to go directly to the patent office, arguing that my patent should be invalidated because of their provisional. But nothing worked. The legal reality was clear. I owned the patent, they were infringing, and their options were limited to licensing or litigation they couldn't afford. The second meeting was different. Brandon was defeated and he knew it. He opened by asking what I wanted, what terms would make this go away. I told him I wasn't interested in licensing fees. What I wanted was for him to acknowledge something, to admit something he'd probably forgotten entirely. Before we discuss terms, I said, I want to show you something. I pulled up the video on my laptop. Future nobody. Him standing on those stairs in his garage, recording me mopping the floor in my mother's uniform. The video was 16 years old, but it still existed. still lived online in archived form, still represented a moment that had changed the entire trajectory of my life. I watched his face as he recognized it, watched the confusion turn to comprehension, turn to horror as he realized who I was, the maid's son, the kid he'd humiliated so thoroughly that I'd become a joke, a meme, a cautionary tale about what happened when you didn't belong. "That's you," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "That's me," I confirmed. 15 years old, working to help my mother pay rent, being turned into entertainment for people like you. He sat back in his chair, and I could see him trying to process this, trying to figure out what it meant, how much danger he was in. "I was a kid," he said finally. "We were both kids. That was a stupid thing I did, but it was 16 years ago. You can't..." "Can't what?" I interrupted. "Can't hold you accountable, can't expect consequences, can't use legal means to protect intellectual property I legitimately developed and patented." "You did this on purpose," he said. "You sought me out. You invested in my company specifically to do this." "You sought me out," I corrected. "You came to my office asking for money. I just chose to say yes, and I did develop the technology independently. Your provisional patent was sloppy, left gaps. I found them and filed properly. That's business." His attorney tried to intervene, started talking about fraudulent inducement and bad faith dealing, but my attorney shut that down immediately. There was no fraud. I'd invested real money, provided real value, conducted myself as any investor would. The patent filing was separate, defensible, legal. Proving otherwise would be nearly impossible. Brandon looked at me with something close to desperation. "What do you want? Just tell me what you want, and let's end this." "I want you to come with me to Ashbury Lane," I said. "To your parents' house, the house where my mother worked for years, where you saw me that day and decided to turn it into a joke. And I want you to apologize to her. Face to face, at that door, you're going to tell Valerie that you're sorry for what you did to her son. Sorry for the bullying, sorry for the video, sorry for making our lives harder than they already were." He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You want me to apologize to your mother? That's what this is about?" "That's what this is about," I confirmed. "You do that sincerely and completely, and I'll give you a licensing agreement for the patent. $5,000 a month. Perpetual license, no equity requirements. You'll be able to keep building Northfield without worrying about infringement. And if I refuse, then I enforce the patent fully. You shut down the algorithm, rebuild from scratch without infringing, lose 6 to 12 months of development time, probably lose your next funding round, possibly lose the company entirely. Your choice." He looked at his attorney, who nodded almost imperceptibly. There was no alternative that was better than this. Humiliation and survival, or pride and destruction. When you framed it that way, the choice was obvious. "Fine," he said quietly. "When?" "Saturday," I said. 2:00. I'll meet you there." I didn't tell my mother what was happening. Didn't want to give her time to talk me out of it, or refuse to participate. I just told her we were going for a drive Saturday afternoon, that there was something I needed her to see. She trusted me, completely by then, had learned over the years that when I said I needed something, I had good reasons. We drove to Ashbury Lane in my car, a nice sedan, but nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed wealth or success. My mother got quiet as we turned onto the street, recognized where we were going. "Why are we here?" she asked. "You'll see," I said. Brandon's car was already there when we arrived, parked in the circular driveway, like he belonged there, which he did. I parked on the street, and my mother and I walked up to the front door together. Brandon got out of his car, and I saw my mother recognize him, saw the confusion on her face as she tried to understand what was happening. "Mom," I said, "this is Brandon Prescott. He has something he wants to say to you." Brandon looked at her, then at me, and I could see him struggling with it, struggling with the humiliation of being forced to apologize for something he'd done as a teenager, something he'd probably forgotten about completely until this week. But he'd made his choice, made it when he decided that keeping his company was worth more than his pride. Mrs. He started, then stopped, realizing he didn't know her last name, had never thought to learn the name of the woman who'd cleaned his house for years. Ms. Valerie, my mother said quietly, filling in the gap he'd created. Ms. Valerie, he continued, I owe you an apology. When we were in high school, I saw your son working here, helping you, and I responded in a cruel and thoughtless way. I recorded him without permission, posted the video online, contributed to bullying that made his life much harder. I didn't think about what that would do to him, or to you, or how it might affect your work and your life. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain I caused both of you. My mother looked at me, looked at Brandon, looked back at me. I could see her trying to piece together what was happening, why this man was standing on the doorstep of his parents' house, apologizing for something that had happened 16 years ago. It's okay, she said finally, because she was kind, because she'd been taught to be gracious, because she didn't understand the dynamics of what was actually happening. It's not okay, I said gently, but it's done. We drove back in silence. My mother didn't ask questions, seemed to sense that I'd explain when I was ready. When we got home, I told her everything. The company, the patent, the legal maneuvering, the choice I'd given Brandon. I expected her to be proud, expected her to feel vindicated, expected her to appreciate the revenge I'd engineered. Instead, she looked at me with profound sadness. Did it help? She asked. Did what help? Making him apologize, making him feel small. Did it fix anything? I wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her that justice had been served, that the scales had been balanced, that we'd won. But the truth was more complicated, because standing there watching Brandon Prescott apologize, watching him humiliate himself because I'd forced him to, I hadn't felt triumphant or vindicated or healed. I'd felt empty, the same emptiness I'd been feeling for years, the void that no amount of success or money or revenge could fill. I don't know, I said honestly. Brandon's licensing payments started the next month. $5,000 automatically transferred on the first of every month. A small price for him to pay to keep building his company, a permanent reminder for me of what I'd done. Northfield Analytics went on to raise their Series A, then their Series B, eventually got acquired by a larger analytics company for $140 million. Brandon made tens of millions from the acquisition, built another company, became successful in exactly the way people from his background become successful. I made money from the acquisition too, since I still owned my 15%. Made enough that the licensing fees seemed trivial in comparison, but I kept them anyway, kept that monthly reminder appearing in my account. $5,000 every month from Brandon Prescott for technology I'd stolen from him legally, for revenge I'd engineered perfectly. My mother never brought it up again, but something changed between us after that day. Not dramatically, not obviously, but I could feel it. She looked at me differently, worried about me in a way she hadn't before. I think she saw what I'd become, saw the coldness I'd developed, the calculating nature that had made the patent thing possible. She'd wanted better for me, and in many ways she'd gotten it. I had money and success and security, but I'd lost something too. Lost it so gradually that I hadn't noticed until it was completely gone. I'm 34 now. I've built 6 successful companies, invested in dozens more, made more money than I'll ever spend. I live in a nice condo, drive a nice car, have nice things that I barely notice. I work constantly, build constantly, move from project to project with the same obsessive focus that got me here. People respect me, seek my advice, want to work with me or invest with me or learn from me. But I don't have friends, don't have relationships that feel genuine or deep, don't trust people enough to let them in, don't believe in anything except work and achievement and the satisfaction of building things. The Brandon Prescott thing wasn't an aberration, wasn't some unique act of revenge. It was just the most visible example of how I operate, how I see the world, how I interact with people who get in my way or threaten what I've built. I won. By every external measure, I won completely. I escaped poverty, built wealth, created success on my own terms. I forced my tormentor to apologize, to acknowledge what he'd done, to pay for it in small ways forever. I proved that future nobody could become somebody, that the maid's son could become the man who owned the patent, that hard work and intelligence and ruthlessness could overcome anything. But I also lost the ability to feel fully, to connect authentically, to believe that people can be good without ulterior motives, lost whatever optimism or trust or basic human warmth that made life feel like it was about more than just winning. I look at other people my age, people with families and friendships and lives that seem full of meaning, and I don't understand them. Don't understand what they value, what they feel, why they care about things that seem so insignificant compared to building and achieving and proving your worth. My mother is 62 now, retired and healthy, living in a house I bought her in a safe neighborhood, with a garden she tends, and neighbors who look out for her. She's proud of me, I think, proud of what I've accomplished. But she also mourns something, some version of me that might have existed if things had been different. If Brandon Prescott hadn't seen me that day, if I'd had the chance to become someone other than who I am. I still smell lemon cleaner sometimes, that sharp artificial citrus that reminds me of houses we cleaned and lives we didn't live, and the enormous distance between where we started and where we ended up. The smell doesn't bother me anymore. It's just information, just data, just another memory that shaped who I became. $5,000 arrived in my account yesterday, the same as it does on the first of every month. Brandon Prescott paying for something he barely remembers, something that meant everything to me, something that defined both of us in ways neither of us fully understood until it was too late to be different people. I won. I keep winning, and every victory feels exactly the same, empty, cold, proof that I'm exactly what they called me 16 years ago. Not future nobody, just nobody in a different form, nobody with money and success and revenge, nobody who traded one kind of poverty for another, nobody who confused winning with healing and achievement with worth. I won, but I'm not sure what I won or what I lost to get here, or whether any of it mattered beyond the satisfaction of proving people wrong. I'm not sure of anything except that I'm still building, still moving, still trying to fill a void that I created myself, that I built as carefully and deliberately as I built my companies, that I'll carry until the day I die. That's the real revenge, I think. Not what I did to Brandon Prescott, but what I did to myself. I became someone who could do that to him, someone who could engineer that kind of calculated cruelty, someone who valued vindication over everything else. I became exactly what I needed to become to survive, to succeed, to win. And that person is powerful and wealthy and respected and completely, irreversibly alone. The maid's son didn't just become somebody. He became somebody who can't remember what it felt like to be someone else. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.